not able to be here tonight will be able to view it on our YouTube channel immediately after we're done or live.
It's still loading. Aha.
Not able to be here tonight will be.
All right, so we are officially on YouTube. So welcome to those who are watching live on YouTube, and hello to anyone who is watching this recording after the fact. Just as a final reminder to anyone that's joined since the last time I said it, we are in a webinar format right now. So if you're joining, you are an audience member or an attendee of the webinar. So you can't share video or sound, but you can use the chat to share any messages with presenters, staff, or with your fellow volunteers. And there will be a chance to share video and sound later if you would like to. And I think that is it for our announcement. So I will turn it over to Allison to get started.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and for those that aren't, for watching it on YouTube. This is very fun. We have an excellent speaker, and I'm so curious about the mysteries of this book. So I'm looking forward to hearing more. Also wanted to point out that September is a super busy month at the Rancho. We have our annual Craft Beer Fest on September 7th. So if you haven't purchased tickets or going to volunteer, please let staff know. Be very cool. And then on the 14th, we have our Rancho to Rancho Walk. So this year, it starts at Rancho Los Alamitos and finishes at Rancho Los Cerritos. And we have a fun party planned at the end. We have several vendors there. Primal Alchemy and Lola's will be providing food. The merchant will be there as well. And we will have quite a few organizations that will be tabling at the event. So it's definitely worth the 9, 6, or 3-mile walk. You can find out more on our website. We're very excited about it. And then our big one in September, the other two are very important, but our big one is our Gala. Adobe Sunset Gala is on the 28th of September. This is our big fundraising event for the year. So hopefully people can attend and support the Rancho. Then moving into October, we are hosting a Day of the Dead event. We are partnering with the Latino Puente Association. And so we are looking forward to that, and that will be on October 27th. So we hope everyone can come to that. So September is an action-packed month. We have a lot going on. Also, for those volunteers that have not done the volunteer DEIA training, is this Saturday, 9:30 to 11:30. We are hosting our last workshop. I know we have 15 wonderful volunteers signed up, but hopefully we'll get some more. So there's a lot going on between the end of August and the end of October, but we're so excited we have all of this going on. And again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Gary, for being our speaker. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alana, who's going to speak to something else that's super important.
Yeah, speaking of fun, great things happening in September, I'm here just to kind of get on your radar the subject of Long Beach Gives. If you've been around since this time last year, this is hopefully something you've heard before. Long Beach Gives is a citywide fundraiser for nonprofits in Long Beach, and it's almost up to 250 that participate. And so it's an opportunity to sort of collaborate for this collective fundraising goal. So each of those nonprofits is raising money for their organization, but by collaborating, we're able to spread the news, spread the word further, get more people involved, and there is an opportunity for donors to give money just to Long Beach Gives in general, which is then dispersed evenly through the nonprofits. The cool thing about Long Beach Gives is that I think it's called crowdfunding. So our gala is an example of an event that the Rancho hosts that is with the goal of, fundraising money for the organization. Long Beach Gives is more grassroots. So for the Rancho, we will have a Rancho page that describes what the Rancho is. It'll have some quotes from people that describe what the Rancho means to them, and some information about just what donation money means to the site. And then within the Rancho's page, you can create a supporter page. So we had several volunteers do this last year, the board, most of our staff did it. So you create an individual page that just gives a little bit of information about why you love Rancho Los Cerritos, which we all do. And you set a personal goal. So last year I started at 100. I actually bumped up to $200. So that is just a goal that you can kind of set, and then you send your page out to your friends, family, coworkers, whoever it may be, and let them know that you're trying to raise money for Rancho Los Cerritos. It's a cool thing because, sometimes I only have $10 to give. It doesn't seem like that's going to be that helpful to an organization. I am more likely to give to someone I already know. And if the goal is $200 and I see they've got, they're $75 away from their goal, my $10 is really going to help. And so it's a great opportunity to bring new people into the Rancho, for you to share about why you're passionate about it. And it's also an opportunity where, smaller donations that they really add up to a really big impact. So we hope that September 19th is Long Beach Gives. Hope that date gets on your radar. But we are also going to be holding kind of a training meeting or introductory meeting that will go over what Long Beach Gives is, and a little bit more of the logistics of how to set up a page, some strategies for that. That will be taking place on Wednesday, September 4th at 4. So the details of this will also be in quick notes when it goes out, but that will be a Zoom meeting and it will be recorded. So if you're not able to attend it live, we'll send out the recording afterwards. Last year we were just shy of our goal of $10,000. So it's really incredible that this one-day event was able to raise that much money for the site. So we're really looking forward to having that again. If you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. And then otherwise, I will see you on the 4th for our little training orientation meeting. But yeah, really looking forward to everything that September and October and beyond will bring. But I think that concludes our announcement. So I'll turn it back over to Laura to get us started.
All right, what we have all been waiting for, we are going to find out about this very famous murder of the 19th century, because this man, Gary Menchen, came in to the Rancho this spring, and he had with him 2 books that he had written. One was about the murder trial, and the other one was the diary of Thomas Flint, which we have in, put together with Brad's, but he published it all with notes and everything. So we now have that in our library. And in case you didn't know, that is kind of the connection to the Rancho. So Gary Menchen lives in Waterville, Maine, and that's where Thomas Flint went to school. And so when he retired from being a computer programmer at Harvard University, he was curious about this murder that he had heard a lot about, and he decided to dive into it and start doing research. And he's going to share that interesting story of what he was able to find out about the murder that happened back in 1848 in Waterville, Maine, and let us know what Thomas Flint had to do with that and why it's such a famous murder. So thank you so much for being here on East Coast time, and I am handing it over to you, Gary.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, this is a story about a murder that took place in Waterville, a thriving village at the time. It had almost 4,000 people in those days. Numerous physicians, at least 7 or 8 physicians, would from checking from the advertisements in the local newspaper. And in the morning of October 1st, 1847, the body of a young man named Edward Matthews was found on a woodpile in the basement of a building in Waterville. He was 23, from a well-to-do Waterville family. He'd worked for his brother, who was an editor of a publication called the Yankee Blade for a few years, but had left to go into business. He'd formed a partnership with a man from Clinton, Maine, and he had taken a herd of cattle down to the Boston meat market in Brighton, which was a common thing at the time. I never thought of this before I began this research project, but there were cattle drives from Maine down to Boston, just like there were cattle drives in the West to various collection points for cattle. So they would typically take a couple of hundred head of cattle and go down, and when he came back, he was known to be carrying about $2,000. The individual who was accused and tried for the murder was a very successful physician, Dr. Valorus P. Coolidge. That's Valorus, although it's frequently misspelled. He was 27. He'd been granted his medical degree by Dartmouth College in 1844. He'd purchased a practice in Waterville from an established physician who had moved west, and he was very, very successful. Because he was successful, because he was young, reputedly very handsome, always described as very well dressed, and perhaps because there hadn't been a conviction for murder in Maine since 1843, the trial was a sensation. Probably mostly because he was an educated professional, and those, of course, would be much rarer than members of the working class, as it were. I have a picture of him, what's supposed to be him anyway, which I will show for a minute. Oops, I've got to share the screen, don't I? Okay, that came from a medical journal, the Maine Medical Association Journal in 1920, which had an article covering the trial by a doctor, mostly defending the physicians who were involved in the autopsy and considering the question of, which a subject that we'll get to, did Coolidge escape from prison or did he actually die in prison? But that's a ways off. The connection to Long Beach and to Rancho Los Cerritos is that one of Dr. Coolidge's medical students was Thomas Flint. It was Flint, accompanied by his brother Benjamin and Llewellyn Bixby, who drove a herd of several thousand sheep, accompanied with cattle, oxen, and horses from the middle of the country across to California. That successful drive, I think, was the basis for the Flint and Bixby land holdings and the numerous business interests that followed. Flint was caught up in a clumsy attempt to cover up the murder, was suspected by some of being involved in the murder itself. He gave false testimony at the coroner's inquest, then changed his story and became the main witness for the prosecution, and finally was, perhaps, the target of an extraordinarily inept plot to have him murdered and framed for the original murder of Edward Matthews. He was apparently actually free on bail prior to the trial, which occurred about 5 months after the murder. And it was noted that there were many of those in Maine who did not expect him to return from Philadelphia, where he was at Jefferson Medical School. The details of the murder are simple. The body was found in the basement of the building. It was recognized as Edward Matthews. It was known by a number of people that Matthews, the day before, had withdrawn about $1,800 from a local bank, a procedure that required a second signature out of an uncle who had insisted on being informed of the purpose of the funds. The purpose was that he was going to loan it to Dr. Coolidge with Dr. Coolidge's books, that is, his accounts receivable, as security. The terms were very advantageous. After withdrawing the funds, he'd gone to a bookshop operated by a cousin and taken a book of forms to draw up a contract for the loan discussing it with his cousin. Then that evening, he had been at a social event at an inn around the corner from Coolidge's office. And he told a friend that he was going over to Coolidge's office to loan him the money. He left at 8, but came back saying Coolidge wasn't there. And then he went again at 9 o'clock and was never seen again. So because of that, after his body was found, suspicion immediately fell upon the doctor because it was widely known that Matthews was going to see him and to loan him money. The same day that the body was found, an autopsy was performed. 3 doctors were appointed to perform the autopsy, including Dr. Coolidge himself and 2 other prominent local doctors. Dr. Coolidge performed the actual autopsy, the dissection. Various reasons are given by different sources for that. Perhaps it was because he was the youngest physician. Perhaps it was because he was the most skilled at dissection. It's impossible to know now. Thomas Flint was also there as Coolidge's senior student. He assisted with the cutting, as it was called at the time, and then he stitched up the body when they were finished. There is testimony that Coolidge removed the stomach and passed it to Dr. Thayer, who smelled it and said it smelled strongly of brandy. Coolidge, or someone, suggested that it be taken out so it would not, quote, scent the room. Eventually, it was given to a Professor Loomis from Waterville College, now Colby College, still here in Waterville, for examination. However, before it was given to him, it spent a few hours in an open bowl in a back alley, placed behind some barrels. Incidentally, earlier that year, in May, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, the precursor to the New England Journal of Medicine, published an article written by Coolidge himself about an autopsy he had performed on a woman, the patient of another physician who had died and on whose case he had been called on to consult. The same 3 physicians, Coolidge, Dr. Thayer, and a Dr. Plaisted, had been present at that instance and had also been attended by the same Professor Loomis. I mention that because as soon as Coolidge was accused of the crime, there was a divide in the area, with some people convinced that Coolidge had done it and others convinced that it was impossible that he could have done it. And the anti-Coolidge faction tried to portray Coolidge as a not very competent physician. And the same day after the murder, the day that the body was discovered, a coroner's jury of inquest was formed, and both Coolidge and Flint were interviewed, both that day and on the next day as well. On the first day, Coolidge testified that he had seen Matthews the day before at 2 o'clock. Matthews came into his office asking to hire some money, $200, to loan to 2 gentlemen who were speculating on land in the West. Coolidge was reluctant, but agreed to loan him the money if he could not get it elsewhere. Then before 8 o'clock in the evening, Matthews came back, said he needed the money, and Coolidge gave it to him. Coolidge testified that Matthew took this $200, combined it with bills he already had in his pocket, and counted them all, which came to $2,000. Matthews left, and Coolidge followed soon after and saw Matthews down the street with 2 gentlemen he did not know. Coolidge then testified that around 9 o'clock in the evening, he went to Williams Hotel to call on Flint and to ask him to come back to the office to help him look up cases in his medical books. This lasted for an hour or 2, and then they individually returned to Williams's hotel where each roomed. Note that the timeline is fairly tight there. Matthews was known to have left the social gathering at around 9 o'clock, and it was various people testified that Flint went over to Coolidge's office around 9 o'clock. Flint's testimony on the same day was that he last saw Matthews in Coolidge's office at 10 a.m. the day before, when Coolidge was not present. Matthews did not say what his business was, and then Flint did not see Matthews ever again. Flint was in the office all morning and again in the early evening. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, he met Coolidge at the doorway to Williams Hotel and was asked to go back to Coolidge's office to, quote, read books in relation to some case he had in Skowhegan. That's a town about 15 miles to the west. He did so. Only he and Coolidge are in the office. He left the office at 10 p.m. and returned to the hotel to go to bed. Coolidge had remained in his office when he left. Coolidge's testimony the second day was inconsequential, but he repeated the bit about being in Dr. Coolidge's office in the evening and not seeing Matthews. Now, a week or so later, Flint changed his account of the evening. When the case finally came to trial, Flint gave different testimony and became the primary witness against Coolidge, and also testified to his own participation in disposing of the body and of Matthews' money. So he then was admitting to having committed perjury before the coroner's jury, which is why when he was free to go to medical school before the trial, he was actually out on bail. The trial was scheduled to start on January 25th of 1848. There was so much interest in it that it was moved from the courthouse to a large church that could reportedly accommodate nearly 1,000 people. This was in Augusta, which was the county seat as well as the state capital. If Waterville had a population of 4,000, Augusta had a population of 8,000. So when that church was filled during the trial, that's a pretty high proportion of people spent their work week going to the trial. Capital trials are held before a combined group of judges of the Maine Supreme Court. On the first day of the trial, the jury pool was called to attendance, but then the prosecution announced that the judges that a key witness, Mr. Williams of Williams Hotel, was ill with a lung complaint and could not attend. There was some back and forth about that, but then they eventually realized they had to delay the trial. This was to the great indignation of some reporters who had come all the way from Boston to cover the trial for the newspapers down there. The trial began again on March 14th, 1848, and the case of the prosecution ran for 5 days and with a few brief witness recalls on the 6th day, which was the following Monday. The prosecution called numerous witnesses to show that Matthews withdrew funds from the bank and told several relatives that it was to be loaned to Dr. Coolidge. They reported on activity in the building where Coolidge's offices were. There was a tailor shop on the first floor, on several floors of the building, and the top of which was next to Coolidge's office, which is also upstairs in the same building. That was really totally inconsequential, although they interviewed about 5 people about it. There was testimony about the autopsy and the discovery of prussic acid in the murdered man's stomach, and considerable detail about the process of identifying prussic acid was given. That kind of chemical analysis was very new back in the 1840s. There was testimony from Coolidge's other medical students about discussions on obtaining a body for dissection. Probably the prosecution was implying that this was to Coolidge laying the groundwork for having a body in the office. But that seems far-fetched because Flint, at the very least, and probably the other students would have recognized Matthews as well. Numerous people testified that they had loaned Coolidge money or had been approached by Coolidge to loan him money. The total amount of debt testified to as carried by Coolidge amounted to a couple of $1,000s. And they testified that they were frequently asked to keep the loan secret. There was later testimony that Coolidge was carrying $6,000 on his accounts receivable. So a $2,000 debt is not going to ruin him. There was testimony about finding amounts of money secreted in various different buildings nearby, and Matthew's gold watch was found in a shed in a sleigh of Coolidge's in storage in a loft. There was testimony about Coolidge ordering prussic acid as, quote, as strong as could be had, end quote, from 2 different pharmacists. Several physicians were called to testify that they either never used prussic acid for medicinal purposes or hardly ever had. There was bizarre testimony from a person who was walking his dog down the street and the dog howled strangely when opposite Dr. Coolidge's office. As you can imagine, the defense attorney had a lot of fun with that, both in cross-examination and then in his summing up. I think they quoted a bunch of Shakespeare back and forth to each other from Macbeth. And finally, on the fifth day, Flint testified. He must have been he was on the stand for more than 5 hours. The cross-examination portion was at least 3 hours. Flint was in an awkward situation, and his testimony was the center of interest for the entire trial. But it was notable that he held up very well and was calm the entire time and never got confused or mixed up. I think the crucial part from his testimony, I'll read direct from the newspaper reporter's recording. Trials at that time didn't have an official court reporter, but in this case, there were many different reporters transcribing as much of the trial as they could. And in fact, I know of 5 different complete accounts of the trial. We went to the office. As we passed in, the doctor made me pass in by him. Witness, that is Flint, stood by the side of the table at the right hand of the door. There was a dim lamp burning fluid on the table. After locking the door, Dr. C came up before witness and said, "I am going to reveal to you a secret which involves my life." Said he, "That cursed little Ed Matthews came in here, drank some brandy, and fell down dead. He now lies in the other room. I have thumped him on the head to make folks think he was murdered. I then sat down in the chair which stood behind me, a rocking chair. He asked me what he should do with him. I replied, I did not know. We sat there a few minutes without anything being said." That's a pretty gothic setting to imagine. There's details I won't get into on why Coolidge thumped the corpse on the head to make it look like he was murdered, and it was basically because it would ruin his practice to think that there's no plausible explanation for that. Anyway, Flint then testifies about their discussions concerning what to do with the body. Coolidge wanted to dump it in the river, but Flint did not think they could get it there. Flint did agree to help Coolidge carry the body down into the cellar where they put it on a woodpile. He goes into considerable detail on carrying it down the stairs in the dark and groping about to find the woodpile. Then, over the next few days, he and Coolidge are often up all night talking over the matter. He disposes of a large amount of money Coolidge passed to him because it might be embarrassing to be found with it. Flint never counted the amount. Some of it was secreted in various places. Most of it he threw into a stove to burn. I think it's pretty clear that Flint's testimony was critical to the prosecution, and that without it, they probably couldn't have gotten a conviction. The most damning thing was that they knew that Matthews was going to Coolidge's office, but no one actually saw him do so. And the prussic acid was also strange, but there was no direct evidence other than Flint's. An example of how Flint's testimony and demeanor were viewed was written by William Matthews, the murdered man's brother, in his publication. I'll quote from it, "Of the various witnesses who took the stand during the trial, none acquitted themselves better under the circumstances than Flint. The circumstances under which he appeared were particularly trying, and it would have surprised no one had he been greatly embarrassed and confused. He was, however, calm as a clock, told his story in the clearest and most succinct manner, without verbiage or contradiction, and finally stood the fire of a severe and scrutinizing cross-examination for nearly 3 hours, without flinching or embarrassment. Mr. Evans, the defense attorney, plied him closely with questions of every sort and shape, but it was evident from the beginning that the witness was more than a match for him, and, having the truth on his side, could not be in a contradiction." It's interesting. This is one of several pieces that William Matthews wrote defending Flint. which seems to have been his spontaneous reaction to the situation. So, I mean, the editor of the local newspaper also went out of his way to defend Flint's situation. So there must have been something about him that made people take notice of him and admire him. The defense lasted for a couple of days. They called for testimony about the contents of Matthew's stomach, which smelled strongly of brandy, and pointed out that it had been left unattended outdoors and that prussic acid in any case is extremely volatile. So it should have just evaporated and outdoors uncovered for hours. Then there was testimony about the uses of prussic acid in medicine and how it was in common use by, quote, progressive physicians. A pharmacist from Boston who had been summoned by the prosecution to testify about one of Coolidge's orders for prussic acid said that it was in common use by all the best physicians in Boston. The judges refused to allow any reading from medical reference books on the subject, though. There were numerous testimonials as to Coolidge's good character. It is noticeable that the prosecution was not able to get a single person to testify against Coolidge's character. This was probably part of the reason it became such a controversial trial, because people couldn't believe that someone could exist in good character for years and still commit such a really basically silly crime. There was testimony about Matthews being involved in card games with shady characters. This testimony was not very convincing, though. There was testimony about Coolidge's good financial standing, how he was not being pressed by any creditors, and how he had $6,000 owed to him at the time of the murder from his medical practice. And then they ended up with reading Thomas Flint's testimony from before the coroner's journey, showing that he had committed perjury, admittedly, either before the coroner's jury or in the trial itself. That was emphasized in the summing up by the defense attorney, who basically told the jury that really they should disregard Flint's testimony, and because he was a perjurer, and without Flint's testimony, the prosecution had nothing but a few random details. Then after 2 days of deliberation and 3 separate reports by the jury foreman that they could not reach an agreement, Coolidge was found guilty. That's the first half of the story. So that's a crime. You'd have to believe that it's hard to believe it was deliberate murder, but if it was an accident, how could they be so idiotic as to hit him on the head to make it look like murder, as if that was somehow better than having someone do what they said, what Coolidge told Flint that Matthews had done, picked up a bottle and drunk from it and fallen dead. He could have picked up the wrong bottle. But anyway, I mentioned that the editor of the Easton Mail, the local newspaper, was a strong defender of Flint. On the October 18th, about a week after, 10 days after the murder, and after it was known that Flint was changing his testimony, they published a piece which I'll read a little bit from. For nearly 2 years past, Mr. Thomas Flint, a son of the Honorable W.R. Flint of Somerset County, has been a student of medicine in Dr. C's office. He had admitted being in the office in the evening after young Matthews was known to enter it. And though he denied all knowledge of the murder in his examination before the inquest, there was a suspicion that regard for his friend and teacher had prevented his disclosing what he knew on the subject. Young Flint had 3 times sent for his father after the murder, but the message was repeatedly intercepted, and Senator Flint received the information only in time to arrive in Waterville on Thursday morning. And after consulting his friends in regard to all the circumstances, took his son to a private room at Williams Hotel and requested a full disclosure of whatever he might know relative to the murder. The father's course was successful. I think that's a fairly leading and slanted way of portraying the events. There's no evidence that anyone actually intercepted Flint's letters to his father. And in fact, the prosecution attorney offered to show the letters, not the letter, but the letters to the judges, but the judges at the trial, but the judges declined to see them. After the trial was completed, the Eastern Mail reprinted another article by William Matthews, the brother of the murdered man, defending Flint. Matthews was convinced that there was no evidence at all that Flint knew anything about the murder before he was called into Coolidge's office that evening. And that's certainly true from anything that we can tell nowadays. But in another section, and this was the most interesting to me, fourthly, he wrote, if Flint was guilty equally with Coolidge, is it not singular that he dared return to the trial? What assurance had he of safety if he came back from Philadelphia? Might not new facts affording the most damning proof of his guilt have been discovered and kept secret during his long absence of 5 months or more, ready to be drawn out in terrible array against him on his return? Had he no fear of convicting himself by his answers on cross-examination? Hundreds predicted last fall that he would never appear as a witness against Coolidge, that he would let his father, who was abundantly able to pay his bail, and strike for the South or some foreign country. On the supposition of his guilt as an original accomplice in the murder, it is a marvel that he did not. So I think that's interesting because it shows that even then there were a significant number of people that thought that Flint was more than a kind of accidental accomplice after the fact. And one last thing that the Mail did in their effort to rehabilitate his reputation, in 1849, they published a note about receiving a copy of the graduation pamphlet from Jefferson Medical College. Flint had actually been entitled to receive his medical degree the year before, but the college had deferred granting it to him while the affair with Coolidge was still going on. But in 1849, he got his degree, and the editor of the paper took it to mean that they had discovered nothing in Dr. Flint's connection with that affair which should exclude him from the confidence of the public as a physician or a citizen. We believe the sentiments of this community will sustain the college in this opinion. One more thing now about the trial and Flint. The Monthly Law Reporter was a Boston law reports journal that had quite a long and successful life. They published a bunch of criticisms of the trial. One of them was that the judges didn't give sufficient weight to Coolidge's acknowledged good character, and that for a successful physician to commit murder of such a pointless and stupid way, they should have shown more direct reason for it. But then they say that I'm quoting, the most indispensable witness to the government was a medical student in the office of the prisoner who not only denied any knowledge of the transaction immediately after its occurrence, but fabricated a false account of the matter before a coroner's journey. Afterwards, becoming alarmed and having taken the advice of his father, he was induced to come forward and state that he had perjured himself, that he had seen the body of the murdered man in the prisoner's office, and then having been told that he had died in a fit, he and the prisoner acted in concert in removing the body and in destroying all evidence of the crime. The testimony of an accomplice is always odious, still more so when the oath by which it is supported is proved to be worthless by the open acknowledgement of the violation of a previous one. A person convicted of false swearing in any shape is forbidden to testify. And during the testimony of the medical student, his previous perjury was the indispensable condition for his credibility during the trial itself. And it was replied upon to procure the conviction of the very man whose crimes he acknowledged that he had shared. What a mockery of justice under the name of the law. And then the writer goes on to give an example of some respected citizen of mature years who 40 years before had pleaded guilty to false swearing in a trivial matter to get the matter behind him, and then now was forbidden he couldn't sign a contract or a bill of sale. Okay, so that's 2/3 of the issue. Flint was still under a cloud, at least to some people. But that was cleared up subsequently. In Maine at that time, the law required that a person convicted of murder in the first degree be held in solitary confinement for a year before being hung. This was partially in response to a strong sentiment against capital punishment in Maine, and it was felt that a year would give time for, if there was something would come up that would make the guilt seem less likely, that would provide time for it. But anyway, Coolidge's sentence was actually commuted to life imprisonment. Then on May 24th, 1849, a number of different newspapers throughout the state had a sensational announcement, all at the same time, that on May 16th, it was discovered that Coolidge was plotting to have Flint killed by another prisoner who was due to be released. And on May 18th, 2 days later, Coolidge was discovered in his last throes in his cell. He was on the floor, his head partly in his night bucket. That's a nice touch, isn't it? Which was tipped over and empty. He appeared to be in a fit of some kind, with considerable body froth and serum being discharged from his mouth and nose. He died within 5 minutes of being placed on his bed. That's actually strangely like the symptoms of poisoning by prussic acid. The plot, which I'll describe in detail, was the height of absurdity. And this sudden death, the absurd plot, and then a botched description of the autopsy of Coolidge fed rumors that lasted for at least 5 decades. It's the information from the plot came from the prison's warden, and it consisted of 3 longish documents written by Coolidge. First, very detailed instructions to his accomplice on how to murder Flint and frame him for Matthew's murder. Secondly, a long letter that was to be used as Flint's supposed letter of confession for having murdered Matthews. And thirdly, a letter to be written by the accomplice to Flint after the letter forged in Flint's handwriting had been prepared to lure Flint to a hotel in Bath where the murder was to occur. The instructions were bizarre and strangely detailed. They began with, go direct to Bangor, buy a pair of green specs. Those are presumably for disguise. He's then to go to Waterville or on to Anson, where Flint's family lived, to locate Flint. He is to feign sickness and call on Flint for treatment. He is to have Flint write out a list of books he should purchase for his own education. Why he should ask or why Flint should do that is not mentioned. He is to request a receipt, and here I'll quote, then make him make out his bill. If he says he shall charge nothing, then say, make it out and receipt it by gift, that it is a rule of yours and you cannot break it. Call and register your name as Cathew E.I. Moolidge. In that way, you will get my name and Matthew's almost in full, of which you will need very much. As far as Cathew I.E. Moolidge is obviously Matthew and Coolidge with the C and the M reversed. I find that totally unbelievable. It's like a high school prank. The accomplice is to use these examples of Flint's handwriting to forge a pages-long letter of confession in Flint's handwriting, and then kill Flint, first by striking him on the head with a bar of iron purchased in Bangor, the size very specifically specified in the instructions, and then forcing prussic acid down his throat. He plants the forged letter of confession on Flint's body or in some other place where it would be noticed and escapes to await his reward from Coolidge, who is sure to be released when the letter of confession is found. The letter of confession that Flint is supposed to have written is even crazier. It goes on for pages. A few excerpts. Dr. Coolidge ever treated me as a dear and only brother. I treated him with all the cruelty of a pirate. His treatment to me and mine to him is ever before me, and so great is my misery that I cannot live. I make the following confession and take my life. I, Thomas Flint, murdered Edward Matthews. Dr. V.P. Coolidge is as innocent as a lamb. And he goes on to say he was connected with some other physicians who were equally guilty and so on. And way down, pages later, he says, Dr. Coolidge's superior skill, his lofty reputation, his love of profession and fervent friends were the cause of his ruin. And he goes on more about how guilty he feels. And then he says, I have wrote more than is necessary, perhaps, but I wish to free my conscience and restore to Dr. Coolidge the glory and honor that belonged to him. I need not speak of his professional skill. His practice stands without a parallel in his country. Well did one of the physicians connected with me say that Dr. C's appearance in a sick room was enough without his saying one word to gain the eternal confidence of the sick. He has no failings by which we can injure him. And if we do not injure him in this way, the time is not far distant when he will take all of the praise and we must ever be in the ditch. Oh, when I think of his age, his beauty of person, his lovely countenance, and his sweet voice, his noble heart, his amiable disposition, his superior skill, and the fair prospect that was before him at the time we ruined him, it seems as if I could not endure life for a moment. And it goes on like that some more. All I can think of is a couple of adolescents snickering over a letter that they're forging someplace. It's notable that the document, which takes 8 pages in an average size book, so it must have been even larger written out on paper, was ever seen by anyone other than the warden. And it was discovered because Coolidge had supposedly given it to another prisoner not connected with the affair, who was confined in his sickbed for no reason at all other than perhaps to impress him. And when that sick prisoner refused to return the documents to him, he did nothing about it. This struck many people at the time as absurd also. And another person offered a reward for information about the document. The Portland Advertiser, a newspaper, wrote on October 30th, 1849, that Dr. Mann offers $500 reward to anyone who will produce the man on whose purpose was found the ridiculous papers disclosing the awful scheme to murder Flint. Also, the man that was to accomplish the dreadful deed. The original documents in Coolidge's handwriting, and so on. That offer was never taken up. I mean, $500 is a pretty significant amount of money. I'll also say that I've looked at the records of the number of prisoners who were at the state prison in 1849, and there was no one due to be released in the fall who seems like a likely candidate for a violent crime. So at the very least, the affair was bungled by the warden, because if it was real, he could hardly have destroyed the original documents. The autopsy on Coolidge also raised suspicions. The day after his reported death, they did a physician, and it was reported that he was basically healthy, but his heart was very small, weighing only 9¼ ounces. It was the general opinion that he died in a fit brought on by extreme mental depression and the general prostration of his whole nervous system caused by the sudden frustration of his long-fostered hopes. This struck many people as unconvincing. And in fact, another doctor who had been a classmate of one of the 2 doctors who performed the autopsy, they'd both attended the Bowdoin Medical School, wrote that he was now convinced that Coolidge had not died, but had somehow escaped because the autopsy was too full of blunders to be possible. That the small size quote given for the heart, meant to suggest death due to heart failure, was not in fact an abnormal size at all. And he then goes on to quote from established medical authorities statistical information about the distributions of heart sizes. And yes, that size was in the low end of what's normal, but it was perfectly healthy. Naturally, this led to questions about whether Coolidge was really dead or not. His body had been taken and buried at his family's home in Canton, Maine. There it was dug up twice for examination by competing sides of the question of whether Coolidge was dead or alive, or in his grave or not in his grave. One side said that the body in the coffin had a completely different build from Coolidge. The second group, after they dug up the body, reported that it was indeed Coolidge, and they published a letter under the name of a prominent and highly regarded physician, Cornelius Holland, that the body was certainly Coolidge's, and that any discrepancies between the body and the expected appearance of Coolidge would be due to the results of the autopsy and the decomposition of the corpse. However, the validity of this report was destroyed when it was learned that the letter was from the physician's son, Cornelius Holland Jr., who had the same name but was a farmer and had no medical experience. Coolidge's own father signed a deposition that his son had a finger missing a joint in the thumb of one hand, and that the body in the coffin did not, and said something like, the body was not what I expected to see for my son. Decades later, in 1892, during one of the periodic reoccurrences of interest in the affair, a Rockland newspaper published a letter from a well-known local man who wrote that he had worked with a man who was from Coolidge and knew Coolidge in school, was from the same town as Coolidge and knew Coolidge in school. And I'll quote, I says the gentleman, I was a schoolmate of Dr. Coolidge, knew him well, knew he had a birthmark, which I had frequently seen. A piece too had been cut from the end of one thumb. I knew I could identify his body by these marks. When his body was taken up, I was one of the committee and started for the grave with no other thought than that of finding Coolidge. But when we came to the family burying yard, neatly fenced in from a pasture, we were shown a grave on the pasture side of the doctor's grave. Oh, as the doctor's grave. The doctor's grave was outside the fenced-in area for the family cemetery. This excited my suspicion, and when he examined the body, I found no birthmark, but two perfect thumbs. All of these things were published in multiple newspapers throughout the state and wider probably, and the practice was that when one newspaper published something, the other newspapers would pick it up and publish the same thing and then make their additions, and it would go back and forth. So it was kept alive for a long time. Naturally, this led to Coolidge being seen. The most prominent story appeared in November of 1849. A letter was received from a former resident of Maine dated Short Bar, 30 miles from Coloma, September 3rd. That's in California, of course. Addressed to a gentleman in Boston, in which he finds the following extraordinary paragraph. I'm quoting. The writer says he was well acquainted with Coolidge and Waterville and cannot be mistaken in his statement. Yesterday morning, there came up here 3 strangers from Sacramento City, one of whom I recognized as the notorious Dr. Valorus P. Coolidge, formerly of Waterville, Maine, the alleged murderer of Matthews. Could I be mistaken? How came he here? And so on and so forth. He did note that Coolidge was more roughly dressed than he used to be in Waterville. This continued on from time to time. Some of the sightings were absurd. In 1874, he was declared to be the leader of a gang of train robbers in Iowa. They basically took the shell of the original story and elaborated it with a lot of made-up materials. The final major report on Coolidge occurred in 1892 and originated in a California weekly, the Tuolumne Independent. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. But it was reprinted in various papers. The last number of the Tulumne Independent tells the story of a meeting between Mrs. Richard Parker, formerly of Maine, and Coolidge on the street of Columbia, California. This meeting took place many years ago, shortly after Coolidge's escape. He tried to deny his identity, but could not deceive Mrs. Parker, and finally confessed. Mrs. Parker became a friend to Coolidge and nursed him through a case of smallpox in 1852. Finally, the culprit died a natural death and was buried in Springfield, California. Mrs. Parker lately revealed the secret, which for the first time was given to the public through the columns of the Independent. And that's basically the end of the story. The murder and the trial was covered in various books on notable trials or notorious crimes throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century. Most writers end their account by saying that it was suspected strongly that Coolidge escaped, or there is good evidence to believe that Coolidge escaped, or something like that. I'm not sure any recent writers have thought that. And that's it.
Thank you, Gary. That was absolutely amazing. All of those twists and turns. So
Yeah. It's absurd, isn't it?
it is. It's all absurd. My question, what I can understand is if he claimed that he drank something and died accidentally, why didn't he try to say it was an accident?
Okay, so I'm not sure if that ever made it to testimony in court. So I just have some newspaper hearsay accounts on that. And the only one I saw was that Coolidge said it would ruin his practice for someone to have died in his office. Now, I don't find that very convincing. But on the other hand, I don't think that Flint framed Coolidge. So I don't know. It's hard to reconcile an intelligent man in his right mind doing the various things that Coolidge is said to have done.
Right. Did you have other pictures besides Coolidge that you were going to show?
Oh, somewhere.
Oh, that's okay. I thought maybe they were just on the same.
Well, they are. I just lost my mouse. That's all. Okay, so. Oh, I am screen sharing.
Yeah, you are.
Oh, okay.
You can just progress to the next picture. Did you have the next picture in there?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I didn't realize I was still doing that. So this is the announcement of the original murder, October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. It says no, I can't see it here. Oh, the following in substance was issued on a slip from this office on Monday. So they actually printed out a narrow strip of paper and distributed it in the streets and sent it to the surrounding newspapers as well. So this was before United Press International or anything like that. So the newspapers regularly sent each other stories to reprint.
Mm-hmm.
And now, well, I'm going to have to view my sidebar. I'm sorry to be inept at this, but something's not working. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and go back to.
Well, was there anything that important to?
No, it really wasn't
Yeah.
important. I mean, having heard this for the first time and seeing a plan of the street in 1850 in Waterville, I don't think that would be very informative, really.
Okay.
I did have some pictures of Flint, but you probably all know what he looks like anyway. So.
Yes. Well, most of us, I think, do know what Thomas Flint pictures look like. Hey, he was also a handsome man.
He was and clearly had to be a very remarkable person and a very cool character. I mean,
Well, the part
he,
about him changing his mind after his father comes to talk to him makes sense. I mean, he was a
right.
very young man, right?
Yes, they were all young men. I mean, so
Yeah.
Flint was, Matthews was 23. I think Flint was like 25 or something, and Coolidge was 27. So they weren't they weren't teenagers. They were all young men together. I think 2 years between each of them. Very cool character. He actually, I didn't mention the name today, but one of the other doctors involved in the trial was a Dr. Noyce. And when Flint was going across the country to collect the cattle and the sheep to take to California, he stopped and made a social call on Dr. Noyce, who was in Cincinnati at the time. And of course, in the diary, he doesn't mention anything about the trial or anything like that. But
No, I
clear,
don't think
clear,
we didn't know anything about it. Had you ever heard anything about it, Alana?
I have not.
Yes. Um,
it's it's to get a medical degree at that time, you needed to study with a physician for 3 years and attend 2 sessions at a accredited medical school. Um, Coolidge did that with his uncle and then with at Dartmouth Medical School. Flint did it with Coolidge, of course. And so, in a biographical sketch that was published in the 1890s that had information that Flint provided as part of his background, he said that he had a medical degree and he had studied with Dr. Valorus Coolidge in Waterville. And he didn't say how that ended up at all, but it was part of his medical credential.
right. Yes. Yeah, well, it makes sense that he originally would have wanted to defend him because he's his mentor.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And, it really was a dramatic scene. It must have been a dramatic scene when they're in this dimly lit room. There's a dead body over there. The doctor says, I thumped him on the head to make it look like he was murdered. So they're kind of committed to a course of action for which there's no good exit.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't make sense,
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the whole plot, I don't buy the plot at all. I mean, maybe Coolidge didn't escape. Maybe he did. I don't know. Maybe
It
maybe
sounds like Coolidge paid off the warden to for him to escape.
there was certainly people who thought that, and in later years, Coolidge had an older sister who lived in Missouri, I think, and she came up to Maine when he was in prison that winter to provide food and comfort. Another brother came to visit also, who was out in the Midwest someplace. And later on, she was converted into a young and beautiful girl who seduced the warden and got allowed Coolidge to escape. And that's not true. The warden did leave the prison, and he did marry the following year, but not to Coolidge's sister. And
Hmm.
she was 7 or 8 years older than Coolidge himself and died in New Orleans a few years later.
Interesting. Well, I think it's time. Why don't we promote our people and they can ask you any questions if they have. So hold on for a minute. We'll try to promote you and then we can all talk if we are promotable. All right, I think that everybody is promoted that's promotable. All right, everyone. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask Gary? Okay,
I
we're
hope
all
it made some
confused.
sense.
No, we're all confused at how it all what really happened.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really know what happened at this distance. I mean, you'd
Yes.
have to find some original document or something like that. I mean, it's fun to speculate.
We
It's
have a question. So Thomas Flint, you know, if he was an accomplice to the murder by disposing of the body, did anybody ever, were there any consequences for that?
no, he was, like I said, he was on bail at the time, and of course, the defense attorney questioned him and basically said, "Did you get a deal from the prosecution for giving your testimony?" And Flint said that no, that his father told him that he had talked to somebody and they would see what could be done, but there had been no promises. But I never found anything about the bail being formally revoked or anything like that, but he was obviously free to do whatever he wanted after the trial. So no, there were no consequences that I know of.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Gary. That was very fascinating. I can see why you were prompted to spend all this time trying to figure it out.
Yes, it was. Yes, thank you. Thank you. It was fun.
One of our panelists is saying Flint never practiced medicine, correct?
Uh, well, yes, he did practice medicine. He talks about it in his diary of his travels back and forth to California. He treated several people during that time. Somebody had something and he gave him some medicine and charged him $5 or something in Central America.
Did he ever set up an office, and that was never his primary livelihood?
No, I mean, I have just a narrow view of his career. I know from some biographical accounts that I've seen that he did do some casual medical work in his early days when he was someplace and somebody needed medical care and there were no physicians around. But it was not, he never set up permanently as a physician that I know of, no.
Okay. All right. Well, we usually have a check-in, see if anybody has anything they'd like to share. Anybody have any information they'd like to share? Well, I think that we can wrap this up then and call it a night. It's I bet approaching Gary's bedtime now out there in Maine.
Oh my
And dinner
goodness.
time for all of us. So just a reminder, again, it is going to be a busy month at the Rancho in September. Look for emails from me asking you to help out with Beer Fest on Saturday the 7th, Rancho's Walk on the 14th, and we're going to have Long Beach Gives. How you could get involved with that on September 4th in the afternoon. That's going to be via Zoom. So it'll be recorded and just like this, and people can see it later on. So thank you so much, Gary. I'm so glad that you came by Rancho Los Cerritos this spring and shared this this great story with us that we could learn about murders and the funny ways of newspapers and all of that great history.
Yes, it was certainly a close call for Thomas Flint, one way or the other, yes.
It seems like it. Yeah, he got himself in a rough situation. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll be seeing you around the rancho soon, except for you, Gary, but we'd love to see you around next time you come to California.
Maybe next year.
All right. Good
Good night.
night, everyone.
Yeah, good night.
Night.
You're all going to get booted in a couple seconds because I'm going to end the webinar, but thank you for being here.